Claims of Hamas members committing gender-based and sexual violence as a weapon of war on October 7 have been pushed by Israel for the last 2 months. If they are true, the perpetrators must be brought to justice. But to this day, 2 months on, we still haven't seen any real evidence to back up these claims, and international human rights organizations, who normally are the first groups or the main groups that investigate and validate such claims, have not issued a statement supporting Israel's rape and sexual violence narrative. And just a few days ago, in an interview with the Washington Post, Hamas official Bassam Naid denied the claims, stating that committing any form of sexual violence against a woman would go against its founding Islamic principles and considers any sexual relationship or activity outside of marriage to be completely haram, which is forbidden by Islam. He said, whoever does this kind of act is committing a major infraction and would be punished both legally and on Judgment Day. But in a recent interview on France24, Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, an Israeli professor of family law and international women's rights, and the former vice chair of United Nations Committee on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, was asked to respond to questions concerning the issue of proof and why international women's groups do not and have not recognized those atrocities. Professor Halperin-Kaddari's response was, let's say, unconvincing. Let's watch together and assess her response.
Can you elaborate on that point about some of the women's groups maybe not recognizing those atrocities?
Until now, UN Women did not name Hamas and did not say clearly that sexual violence was part of the atrocities performed by Hamas on October 7th. And other international women's organizations or human rights bodies likewise did not recognize the fact that women were weaponized and rape was used as a weapon of war during the October 7th attack of Hamas in Israel.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Professor Halperin-Kaddari just admitted that UN and other women's groups did not and do not recognize or still have not recognized, which means they do not believe or are convinced that rape and sexual violence were used by Hamas on October 7, probably and mainly because there is no concrete proof. On the question of proof or evidence, interviewer William Hildebrandt asks her how it's going.
2 months on, how is the investigation going?
The investigation is still in the very early stages, and it's really important to bear in mind that most of the victims of rape, of sexual assault, were immediately killed. So of those who survived, there's reason to suspect that some were taken hostages, and the very few who remained are not going to speak, at least not for the time being.
Now, I stopped it there because it's important to digest what was just stated and not let it pass without appreciating the enormity of evidence and facts she has just outlined to us. She stated that the investigation was still in its early stages. It's been 2 months. You have a limited number of bodies. You have at your disposal all of Israel's medical facilities, police forensic investigators, political backing, international backing. You are making a very serious claim that, if true, would support your case. To drag your feet on this is suspicious. She also said most of the victims were either killed, taken hostage, or don't want to talk. Okay, we understand that the dead can't talk, and may God rest their souls. However, regarding those that were taken hostage, well, nearly all women and children who were taken hostage have been released, or many of them have. If they had been sexually abused, even if one of them had been sexually abused, wouldn't that have been the first thing they exposed when they came out in press conferences? Again, to validate Israel's accusations and strengthen that argument? Any lawyer or PR expert would be telling the Israeli government to get them out there, roll them out, put them on every TV channel, put them in front of every media organization. If you want to get public opinion back on Israel's side. Another comment she made was that the ones that did survive didn't want to talk, or not for now. I'm really struggling with this because if you have just seen your friends murdered, slaughtered, killed, and you were one of the few that got away, that were lucky enough to get away, wouldn't you want to tell the world about the atrocities that committed by those monsters? And wouldn't you want to do that to ensure that the truth gets out? And so you can turn public opinion back and onto Israel's side and in Israel's favor? Definitely, the world opinion is against Israel. If you want the truth to get out, you need to get the people with the truth out there. So again, on this point, I believe that Professor Halperin-Kaddari failed to convince me. To try and justify the delays and behaviour of those survivors not wanting to talk and why the case is still light on facts, she had this to say.
Without surviving victims, it's more difficult to establish the case.
But then claims they have eyewitness testimony.
However, we already do have eyewitness testimonies of survivor, at least one survivor who described in gruesome details the gang rape with extreme level of brutality that she witnessed a few yards away from where she hid in the bushes.
Okay, well, if you have testimony, why aren't you sharing it? Why aren't you circulating that to help us believe your case? She then goes on to add that they do have evidence from first responders. But when questioned by the host about the type of evidence, is it forensic evidence? She says no. Watch this.
And then all the other evidence of the first responders who collected the bodies, who we have footage.
Can I ask you about that? The evidence from the first responders, what sort of evidence is that? I presume you're talking about forensic evidence.
So there is no forensic evidence because of those bodies who were collected during the first days. The description of the people who worked at the morgue, who are still there, actually, by the way, because bodies are still being collected, or remnants of bodies are still being collected, the description sounds like really being in hell, with hundreds and hundreds of bodies piling up. And the very immediate goal was the actual identification of the victims and bringing to burial.
Now, I wanted to focus on this because he asks if they have forensic evidence. She clearly says no, because the bodies have been in the morgue for 2 months. There are hundreds of them, and it's gruesome, and they need to be ID'd, and they first have to prepare them for burial. You know, firstly, let's get clear about what forensic evidence is. Forensic evidence is evidence gathered through scientific methods like DNA profiling of blood, hair, semen, saliva, bone fragments, tissue, and fingerprints to detect the identity of the perpetrator. You've had 2 months and you've got hundreds of bodies that could and should have been scanned and processed to determine if there is any evidence of foreign semen, saliva, fingerprints, hair, etc., and at least establish if it is Israeli DNA or Arab DNA. The argument that she makes of not having time, I really find hard to believe. Israel is claiming that October 7 was the worst day in its history since independence, even worse than the Yom Kippur War. I find it difficult to reconcile that the weight of all of its institutions have not been placed at the disposal of its military and security officials to find evidence, to parade to the world that Hamas did in fact commit these horrendous atrocities against their women. But then she comes back to say they do have evidence.
However, we do have the photographs of the bodies that were found in the field, of the bodies that were brought to the morgue, and they all exhibit the same signs of women's bodies without their clothes from the waist to the bottom, bleeding from the vagina, from the private parts, very often also being shot there, or shot, excuse me for the gruesome description, but shot in the breasts or in the face. the same degree of mutilation. So there is a pattern that is being repeated and that was found in various locations. And when this is added to other descriptions of women's bodies being found handcuffed to beds in several locations.
Okay, I'm confused. You either do or you don't have evidence. If you do have evidence, show us. Don't tell us. Make us believers. So in conclusion, from the facts we have just presented and the lack of facts that Israel has failed to present after 2 months, one can only conclude that the report of rape and sexual violence is a factually flawed claim. And when we put this into context and combine it with other refuted claims Israel has made since October 7, including the 40 beheaded babies story and the assertions by the IDF and countless Israeli officials, including Benjamin Netanyahu, that Al-Shifa Hospital and many other hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, United Nations facilities and centres, etc., were being used by Hamas as command centres and for storing mass amounts of weapons and artillery, which justified Israel's airstrikes and massacres of civilians. More than 15,000 people have been slaughtered in less than 2 months, 40% of them of whom were babies and children. It is understandable why we have doubts. It is understandable why everything Israel is saying to us is confusing, is doubtful. It is understandable why international human rights organizations do not and have not asserted and validated the claims of sexual violence and rape being used and weaponized by Hamas. This is an important report for everyone to know. So please share it and send through your comments. It's important to keep this discussion going. I'm also going to share a link to the full interview in my caption. So please have a look at it.